Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom. I'm the creator of rulingplanets.com and Christopher Renstrom Astrology. And this time, I wanted to talk to you about the Sun-Neptune conjunction taking place on March 19th. On March 19th, the Sun will conjoin Neptune in the zodiac sign of Pisces for the last time in our lifetimes. Neptune, in astrology, is the planet of illusion and disillusionment. It's a planet that's associated with the otherworldly and the spectral, things that are phantasmal, things that are difficult to explain in our normal day-to-day lives, things that are ineffable, things that are hard to pin down. Neptune, in the zodiac sign of Pisces, has been introducing alternative facts, conspiracy theories, and journeys down the rabbit hole since it first entered the zodiac sign of Pisces, the zodiac sign that it rules, in 2011 and 2012. The reason why I say 2011 and 2012 is because Neptune first dipped its toe into the zodiac sign of Pisces in 2011, retrograded back down to its former zodiac sign that it was traveling through, Aquarius, and then re-entered Pisces for good in 2012. So what can we expect when the Sun conjoins Neptune for the last time in our lifetimes on March 19th? Is this when we wake up from our collective delirium? Is this when we get the big reveal? But there's more to Neptune traveling through the zodiac sign of Pisces than just that. There is more to its agonies and its ecstasies that can ever be dreamt of in our everyday rationales. And that's because Neptune is perhaps the most unfathomable planet of all. One of the attributes that's associated with Neptune is vertigo. I don't know if you're familiar with vertigo or if you've ever experienced it. I've had some major bouts of vertigo in my lifetime, and I can tell you it's unpleasant. It's this feeling that suddenly the room is spinning around you. Now, it's not like the room is spinning around you and your head is spinning on its neck in a complete 360-degree circle. No, it's just this feeling that the room is continually spinning, the part of the room that you can see, and that you're thrown off balance. Sometimes vertigo can get so bad that you have to lie down on the floor because you're that much off balance and the room is still spinning and you have to wait for that sensation to pass. And when that sensation finally does pass, there's a kind of heaviness, a kind of sleepiness that falls over you, and even a kind of high when at last the world has stopped spinning and you can go to sleep. And you go to sleep for a short period of time. And then when you wake, you're sort of dull feeling, but at least the room's not spinning and you can slowly get on with your life. So this idea of vertigo, of being thrown off balance and uncertain as to whether you'll ever regain your balance again, this was the inspiration for Alfred Hitchcock's greatest film, and a film that happens to be one of my favorite films of all time, Vertigo. Vertigo was made in the year 1958, and Neptune happened to have just entered the zodiac sign of Scorpio at that time. So this idea of illusion and disillusionment combined with the themes of the underworld or the descent down into a mysterious place, looking for the secret, looking for a hidden truth. These are the themes that run through the film Vertigo. Vertigo comes from a French novel that was written by Pierre Boileau and Thomas Narcejac, one of France's most successful mystery writing teams. Its original title was D'entre les morts, which means from the dead. How Neptune and Scorpio is that? It was written, actually, with Alfred Hitchcock in mind. The authors didn't think that they could submit a screenplay to Alfred Hitchcock. They had no connections to him in Hollywood. And so they wrote this novel with the express purpose of getting Alfred Hitchcock hooked on it. And indeed, Alfred Hitchcock was, and he notified them. Alfred Hitchcock didn't find out the truth of this until years later, when he was doing his famous interview with the filmmaker Francois Truffaut. It was during Truffaut's famous interview with Hitchcock about his body of work that Truffaut revealed that it was always Boileau and Narcissic's plan to write this novel with the hopes that Hitchcock would read it and adapt it into a film. And he did. It is perhaps his most famous film. It was a flop when it first came out, but over the years, it's pretty much become the great masterpiece of Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Vertigo begins with these sinister strings, right? Vertigo has one of the best movie soundtracks of all time. It was composed by Bernard Herrmann. And the film begins with these sinister strings. We see a criminal who's climbing to the top of a ladder, and he's running across a roof in San Francisco. He's followed by a policeman who is also followed by a detective, Scotty Ferguson, who is played by James Stewart. And so the criminal runs across a rooftop, and he goes and he jumps across an alleyway onto another steep rooftop. The cop also jumps over the alleyway, grabs a hold of that rooftop, that steep incline, clambers on top of, over it, and he's about to chase the criminal when Jimmy Stewart, the detective, Scotty Ferguson, also jumps over the alleyway, but he misses. He's on the roof, but he hasn't gotten a good grip, and he slides back down off this steep roof, and he grabs a hold of the rain gutter, and he's looking beneath him, and there is one hell of a drop between where he is and the alley below. And Scotty is holding on to the rain gutter, which is bending under his weight, and there are beads of sweat, and he's terrified for his life. And at that point, the cop, instead of running after the criminal, is turned around, and he's reaching his hand down to Scotty. He's like, give me your hand, give me your hand. And Scotty's like petrified with fear. He can't do anything. All he can do is look down at the alley below. And the cop's like, give me your hand, give me your hand. And he moves a little bit closer to Scotty, but he loses his own grip, the police officer, and he tumbles over Scotty, and he falls to his death with a horrible scream. And Scotty is just completely terrified and frozen on the spot. We cut to, clearly months later, and Scotty is visiting his friend Midge in her San Francisco apartment with a wonderful view of the city. And Midge's apartment is almost kind of like a loft apartment, that we would see in New York City, or at least a Greenwich Village apartment. It's bohemian. There's art supplies all over the place. There's an easel that Midge is working at. And that's because Midge is an illustrator for a magazine. And she's focused on illustrating this image, which is on her easel. And Scotty is talking about how tomorrow is the day when his corset will come off. Evidently, they had pulled him off this roof, but because he had been there hanging for a very long time, had clearly pulled some muscles, maybe broken a rib or something, and he's been recuperating. And what he's doing when he's talking to Midge is that he has a cane, which he hates having, and he's trying to balance his hat or something like that on it as he's talking to her. And this is a relationship that he has with Midge, who's played by Barbara Bel Geddes, who's wonderful. Now, Scotty's full name is Jonathan Scotty Ferguson. He's got 3 full names there, but he goes by Johny and he goes by Scotty, and they're kind of interchangeable. And these are nicknames of his. The reason we start out like this, and what I love about this beginning scene, this friendship between Midge and Scotty, is that it's a very mercurial friendship. They're old buddies, they hang out with one another. They're really more like brother and sister than anything else. It's clear as the scene goes on that Midge has secret feelings for Scotty, but Scotty either is oblivious or he's just pretending not to notice. So here Midge is working on her easel, and Scotty's just sort of like rambling in the background. And she looks up and she's like, why don't you go away for a while? And Johny or Scotty says, why? And she's like, well, maybe it's a good idea. And he's like, you mean to forget? Oh, Midge, don't be so motherly, And she's like, well, it's an idea. I mean, the corset's coming off tomorrow. You went through a big shock. And maybe before you pick up with your life again, you just maybe want some time off or something like that. And he's like, oh, don't mother me. Don't bother me. I don't need something like that. And, being a Gemini, and to me, he's the Gemini of the group, and Midge is very much the Virgo. He's kind of restless. He has a short attention span. He's, looking at different things. And he looks at something that Midge is studying, because that's what she's drawing on her easel. That's what she's illustrating. And he asks, "What's this doohickey?" And Midge responds, "It's a brassiere. You know about those things. You're a big boy now." And what's wonderful about this is that you see this brassiere, right? But it's not, horizontal. It's vertical. It's vertical, and it's on a wire contraption where it's been stretched. And it looks like something mechanical or strange or peculiar. So the brassiere has almost this kind of like aircrafty look to it, or something along those lines. And Johny says, "Well, I've never run across one like that." And Midge is like, "That's because it's brand new. Revolutionary uplift. No shoulder straps, no back straps, but does everything a bra should do. It works on the principle of the cantilever bridge." And so Johny is immediately like, "Cantilever bridge?" And what I love about this is that what we get established is that Midge is a career woman. She's grounded and she's practical. What we also get about this is the lack of mystery about femininity. Midge, with her horn-rimmed glasses and her short hair and her smart skirt, looks the epitome of a 1950s woman. And she's a career woman. She's making something of herself, which, of course, is also going to be associated to the zodiac sign of Virgo. Virgo was the sign of working women, of jobs that women could traditionally have back before you had before women's lib, okay, or women's liberation in the 1960s, before the feminist movement really takes off. And so those jobs were usually a school teacher, a nurse, or a secretary, a job in which they were an assistant to a man, basically the housekeeping at the office. 1950s was a big time of women as housewives, as housekeepers. This was sort of seen as a sign of prosperity following World War II, that women didn't need to work anymore, that they were called away from the wartime jobs that they had, like Rosie the Riveter, and they were called back home to have children and to administer to refrigerators and clean kitchens and things like that, and be proper housewives. So women who didn't marry, or who were single, who were looking for a career, were pretty much the Virgoan archetype. And Midge, being an illustrator for a magazine, this would be pretty much a typical, maybe even an acceptable career for a woman to have. So for me, this really brings up the Virgo part of her nature, which is Mercury ruled, just like Scotty or Johny is Gemini, which is also Mercury ruled. Fidgety, curious, his mind is running to one thing after another, very conversational. Now, we learn as the scene continues that Midge and Johny were engaged once, but interestingly enough, it was Midge who had called it off. They were engaged for about, I think, 3 weeks there, and Midge had called it off. Now, Johny didn't exactly protest, but Midge was the one who called it off. So what we have established here is that there's a brotherly, sisterly relationship between the two, and that Johny isn't really much of a woman's man. He enjoys his work. He might even enjoy being a bachelor, but he's certainly not interested in getting married or getting to know a woman. So what we have at the beginning of this film, which is very Neptunian in nature, is the split worlds of Mercury and Neptune. Mercury is the everyday world of deadlines and to-do lists, an everyday world where things are explainable and things like, I don't know, bras are utilitarian. There's nothing remotely mysterious. It's just a thing that you wear, a piece of equipment. It's a very mercurial of the typical day-to-day world. And this is set up versus the Neptunian world of Vertigo that we are about to enter, the Neptunian world of the supernatural, of the inexplicable, of the evasive, the mysterious, the world of the unconscious. Now, at the end of this scene, Scotty again is expecting to get his corset taken off tomorrow. And he's like, I feel great. I feel like life is back to normal. And Mitch is like, great. And he's like, this acrophobia, this fear of heights, this is malarkey. let me go ahead and prove it to you. I can prove it to you that I no longer have any fear of heights. And Midge is like, terrific. And he's like, I'm going to climb up that footstool. And she's like, all right. And so there's like a little footstool with 2 steps. And Johny goes and he climbs up 2 steps. And he's like, see, I can look up, I can look down. Nothing wrong. Nothing happens. And Midge is like, that's great, Johny. But why don't we pick a footstool that's a little bit taller? And she brings out this yellow chair footstool that has 3 steps. And Johny goes up 2 steps and he's like, okay, there I go. And she's like, go to the top of the footstool, Johny, to the very top. And so he goes up the 3 steps and then stands on the cushion. And he's like, I look up, I look down, I look up, I look, and his face freezes. And in that moment, there is a flashback, what we would call a trigger to a post-traumatic stress syndrome of hanging from that roof, from that gutter. And he completely sees it all over again. And you can just feel the chill go up Jimmy Stewart's spine in the way that he portrays it. And he collapses almost like in a faint. And Midge catches him. And she's like, oh, Johny, oh, Johny. And he's like this. So what we know, what Hitchcock has set up for us in this scene, is that the acrophobia is still powerful in Johny. He might have physically recuperated from the experience, but mentally and psychologically, he hasn't. In the next scene, Johny meets with a businessman named Gavin Elster, who happened to be an old college buddy of his, and who is now a very wealthy shipping magnate. Now, Gavin hasn't built this wealth by himself. Actually, it's his wife's business, and when he married her, he took over the family business. Again, we're dealing with the late 1950s San Francisco here, and women can't run their own businesses. They have to marry men, and it's the men who go and run the business for them, all right? So Gavin read in the newspapers that Johny had to retire from the police force because of his acrophobia, the whole incident of a police officer falling to his death and a detective being rescued. This made all the headlines in the San Francisco papers, and everyone pretty much knows about it. Much to Scotty's shame, as a result of his fear of heights, a police officer, lost his life. He fell to his death. Johny isn't really doing much with himself these days. He was on the fast track to becoming the chief of police. That was being done by going from police to detective. And now he's been forced to retire from the force. So he's feeling ashamed and very guilt-ridden. And he's sort of at loose ends. Gavin wants to hire Johny to follow his wife, Madeline Elster. And so he's invited Johny to his office for an interview. It's basically a job interview. And he says to Johny, I'm afraid. And Johnny's like, well, what are you afraid of? And he's like, I'm afraid that harm might come to her. And Scotty was like, harm would come to your wife? And he's like, yes. And Johnny's like, from who? And Gavin says, the dead. And Gavin says, do you believe that someone dead can enter and take possession of a living human being? And Johny responds, no. And Gavin says, if I told you that this has happened to my wife, what would you say? And Scotty says, I'd say that you should take her to the neuropsychiatrist or a psychologist or a neurologist or or maybe just the plain old family doctor. And I'd have him check you out too. Gavin describes how his wife, Madeline, can act normally one moment and then suddenly she just empties out the next. And Scotty's like, well, what do you mean by empties out? And Gavin says, well, she just empties out of any expression. It's almost like she goes into a kind of trance. She becomes very vague, very absent. And when she goes out, she even disappears for hours on end with no memory of where she's been. Now, this idea of a malevolent spirit possessing a person, this isn't something that Gavin has just made up. We have many different cultures that talk about spirits of the dead coming and possessing the body of a living person. And it's usually done through ancestry. It's usually done through a member of the family. Maybe it's an ancestor of the family. Sometimes it's even done by a spouse. In Jewish folklore, for instance, they have something called the Dybbuk. And the Dybbuk can be the spirit of a dead person who comes and possesses a living body. So what Gavin's talking about here isn't completely unheard of. In any case, Scotty agrees to follow her, to tail her, I guess is the detective way of putting it. I mean, he's got nothing else better to do with his time, and one could do worse than to follow an absent-minded socialite around the streets of San Francisco. Then we cut to this extraordinarily beautiful scene. It's just, I love this movie so much. We begin with the camera on Jimmy Stewart, Scotty, sitting at the bar in a blue suit. And he looks across the room and the camera moves across Ernie's, which is like this archetypal old San Francisco restaurant where people are having dinner and they're dining, dressed to the nines. And we move across the room and we settle on the back of Kim Novak, Madeline. And she's wearing a bareback dress. It's black. And around her shoulders is this gorgeous, like green opera cape. And she has her hair. She's blonde. Madeline is blonde, and she has her hair done up in a French twist, which is the signature Alfred Hitchcock look for a woman of mystery. And she passes by Johny, and Johny glimpses at her and he sees her in profile. It's this beautiful profile. She stops to look around to see where her husband is. And at that same time that she's looking around with her face to the camera, Johny is turning his face away from the camera so that she doesn't see him. And it's just this beautiful moment, this telltale moment of what their relationship is going to be. Johny has memorized her look. And Johny has also, in that moment with this lush music playing, fallen in love with her. The next day, which is Johnny's first day of work, Johny is out in front of her place of residence, which is the Brocklebank Apartments, which is near the Fairmont in San Francisco. And he watches Madeline appear with her blonde hair up in the French twist. And she's wearing a gray suit, jacket and skirt with a white blouse, and also white gloves. And so he watches her get into her car, which is a very large, almost 1940s looking green car. And she drives into downtown San Francisco. And he follows her a couple of cars behind. Now, the first place that she drives to is downtown. And she gets out of the car and she enters a back alley and disappears through a door. Now, this is kind of peculiar because it's a trash-ridden back alley. I mean, it's not the sort of place that a very well-to-do woman would want to be appearing. Johny goes and he follows her and he's kicking over garbage and things like that, to get through. He opens the door. And what he sees is that this is the rear entrance to a flower shop, one of San Francisco's most famous flower shops, which is the Podesta Baldocchi. And there he watches Madeline as she points out a particular bouquet of flowers, which she purchases. And what it is that it is a small nosegay, which are basically flowers that were used to, sniff and hold up to the nose. It's a very small, packed together bouquet of flowers. So it's not a bouquet that goes in a vase, or it's not long stemmed or anything like that. The flowers are very compacted together, almost to create a flower bloom itself, but it's made up of all of these smaller flowers. And so she purchases this nosegay and she goes back out to the car and she gets behind the wheel and she drives off, and Johny follows her. Now, the second place that she goes to is a cemetery. It's a cemetery at the Mission Dolores. Again, this is a very famous cemetery. It's the oldest burial ground, really, in all of San Francisco. And here the gravestones are surrounded by flowers and cacti and trees. So it's not the sort of well-kept, well-groomed cemetery. There's a kind of wildness to it, but also California formality. Johny follows Madeline into the cemetery, and she goes and she stands in front of a grave. Her eyes fix on a grave, and she goes and she stands in front of this grave for what seems like hours. I mean, it's a very long period of time. She just simply holds the bouquet and she stares at this gravestone emptily. After a period of time, she turns around and she walks away. But before Johny departs the cemetery as well, he wants to get his eyes on what that gravestone is, what she's been looking at. And he goes to the gravestone, and on the gravestone is written the name Carlotta Valdez. It's written Carlotta Valdez, born December 3rd, 1831, died March 5th, 1857. Now, Johny has to hurry up here because Madeline's already behind the wheel of her car and driving. And so he gets into his car and he follows her. He follows her to a third stop. And where she goes is to the California Palace of the Legion of Honor. And he finds Madeline sitting in front of a portrait. And he can see her from behind. And she's looking up at this portrait. It's a portrait of a young woman. And beside Madeline is her nosegay, her small little bouquet of flowers. And Johny notices quite quickly that the bouquet of flowers that is resting next to Madeline on the bench is the exact copy of the bouquet of flowers that the woman is holding in the portrait. And so that's a moment of interest, and Johny calls over a museum guard. And he's like, "Can I ask you a question?" The guard's like, "Sure, go ahead." And he says, "That portrait that the young lady is sitting in front of, can you tell me who it's a portrait of?" The museum guard is like, "Let's look it up in the museum catalog." And then he opens up the catalog and he looks through and he says, "Oh, yes, that is the portrait of Carlotta. It's item number 146 in the museum catalog. You can find it right here. Do you want a copy of the catalog?" And Johnny's like, "Sure, I'll take it." And so it's called The Portrait of Carlotta. And he folds the catalog closed and he tucks it under one arm. And at that moment, Madeline gets up and leaves. And he follows Madeline. And once again, she gets into her car and she drives. And Johny gets in his car and he follows her. He follows her to the fourth and final stop of the day, which is the McKittrick Hotel. It's an old Victorian mansion that's been converted into a hotel. Johny sees Madeline enter the hotel and he waits there. And on the second floor, Madeline opens up a shade and she's standing there in the window. And she's looking out over the city and she turns around and walks back into her room again or walks out of range of what he can see. And so Johny quickly enters a hotel and he sees a hotel manager. She's putting oil on a cactus and he asks for the name of the woman who just entered. And she's like, "We don't really share that information with strangers." And he's like, "Listen, I'm a detective working for the San Francisco police." And she's like, "Oh, in that case, you can see that she signed her name right there. Her name is Carlotta Valdez." And he's like, "Carlotta Valdez." And she's like, "Isn't that a sweet name? A little foreign sounding, but it's sweet nonetheless." And so he asks the woman if she can go upstairs and take a peek, see if she's there. And she's like, "Well, it's not really something that I do." But she does. And she's like, "Well, mister, the room is empty." And he's like, "The room's empty." He's like, "There's no one here." And he looks outside and Madeline's car is gone. And he realizes that Madeline has given him the slip. So Johnny's curiosity is definitely piqued. He's clearly engaged with what's going on here. He follows this woman who goes to a flower shop, who gets a bouquet of flowers. She visits a grave with the name Carlotta Valdez on it. He then follows her to an art museum where she sits gazing at this portrait for a very long period of time. The bouquet that she purchased matches the bouquet held by the woman in the portrait. The name of the woman in the portrait is Carlotta Valdez. And finally, she has signed herself into a hotel that she visits 2 to 3 times a week, and she signs under the name Carlotta Valdez. So Johnny's totally interested with what's going on here. He wants to get to the bottom of this mystery. So, of course, his go-to person for things like this is Midge. So he goes and he shows up at Midge's apartment, and she's like happy to see him. And he says right away, "Do you know anyone who's an old authority on San Francisco history?" And Midge is like, "Wow, you'd think that, you'd say hello to a girl, and you want to know right away who's an authority on San Francisco history." And he's like, "Not someone who's an authority on the big stuff that's happened in San Francisco history. Someone who knows the small stuff from people, we've never heard of, the day-to-day sort of things." And Midge is like, "Oh, you mean the gay old bohemian days of gay old San Francisco. Juicy stories like who shot who in the Embarcadero in August 1879. Well, That person would be Pop Liebel, who owns the Argosy bookshop. And so Johnny's like, can I meet him? And she's like, let me get my coat and we'll drive on over and say hi. And so he gets in the car, they drive on over to the Argosy bookshop. And so they indeed find Pop Liebel right there in his Argosy bookstore. And it's a beautiful bookstore. It's one of those old San Francisco bookstores where, they have shelves that are full of these beautiful books, tables that are full of these large volumes, and there's stairs that lead up to a second floor where you can see the bookshelves as well. And there's those old green banking lamps, that are lighting up the different corners and eddies of the bookstore. It's just the bookstore that you absolutely would dream of and you just don't see nowadays. Anyway, it's run by this old fellow named Pop Liebel. And they ask about Carlotta, and he says, oh, yes, I remember Carlotta. Beautiful Carlotta. And then the sad Carlotta. And Johnny gets right to the point, and he asks, what does an old wooden house at the corner of Eddy and Gough Street have to do with Carlotta Valdez? And Pop Liebel answers, simple. It was hers. It was built for her many, many years ago. Johnny asks, by whom? And Pop Liebel says, the name I don't remember, but he was rich and powerful. It's not an unusual story. She came from somewhere small to the south of the city. Some say it was from a mission settlement. She was young, very young, and she was found dancing and singing in a cabaret by that man. He took her and he built for her the great house in the Western Addition, the house at the corner of Eddy and Gough Street. And there was a child. Yes, a child. I cannot tell you how much time passed or how much happiness there was, but then he threw her away. He had no other children. His wife had no children, so he kept that child, and he threw Carlotta away. A man could do that sort of thing in those days. They had the power and the freedom. And then she became the sad Carlotta, alone in that great empty house, walking the streets alone, her clothes after a while becoming old and patched and dirty. And finally she became the mad Carlotta, stopping people in the street to ask, where is my child? Have you seen my child? After a while, Midge responds, poor thing. And Johnny, and she died? Liebel, she died. Johnny, how did she die? Liebel, by her own hand. There are many such stories. Afterwards, Midge asks Johnny, what's this all about? And Johnny tells her most of what he knows so far. And Midge is just, Johnny, you can't believe this. This is ridiculous. And he's like, well, I don't know. It's what he hired me to do. And she's like, so this is your old college buddy, your chum. He's asked you to tail his wife around old San Francisco, collecting all these different stories and things. And he's like, yeah, that's pretty much the size of it. And Midge is like, clearly she's like having an affair or something like that. I don't think there's any great mystery to it. And Johnny's like, I don't know. I'm just following and seeing what I come up with. And Midge says, I think I'm going to take a look at that portrait myself. And Johnny says, now, Midge, don't cause any trouble. And she's like, I'm not going to cause any trouble. I'm just going to go and take a look at that portrait. That night, Johnny meets with Gavin, who confirms what he's uncovered and fills in some of the details. Carlotta Valdez was Madeline's great-grandmother, and the child that was taken from her was Madeline's grandmother. The McTitrick Hotel is the old Valdez home. Gavin also shares with Johnny that Madeline had inherited several pieces of Carlotta's jewelry. Now, Gavin didn't really think much of it because it was old and old-fashioned, and Madeline didn't really think much of it either, until in recent weeks, Madeline began taking the jewelry out of its box and trying it on, and looking at herself blankly in the mirror. There was a particular piece of jewelry that Madeline would try on, And that was an amber necklace. And pointing to the catalog that Johny is sharing with Gavin, Gavin says, "Do you see it? It's there in the portrait. Carlotta is wearing that necklace in the portrait." And Johny closes the catalog and says to Gavin, "Well, that explains it. Anyone can become obsessed with the past with a background like that." And Gavin says to Johny, "Madeline has never heard of Carlotta Valdez." And Johny says, "She doesn't know about the grave, the portrait, the old house on Eddy Street?" And Gavin says, "Nothing." Johny, "Well, when she goes to those places," and Gavin says, "she is no longer my wife." "So how do you know all these things that she doesn't?" And Gavin responds, Her mother told me before she died. I dug out the rest myself." Johny, "Why wouldn't she have told her own daughter?" And Gavin says, "Natural fear." "Johny, her grandmother went insane, took her own life. Her blood is in Madeline." Now, this brings up the interesting specter of the 12th house in astrology. The 12th house is a house that's often associated with the zodiac sign of Pisces, and it's what I call the skeletons in the family closet house. What I found by working with astrological charts is that whatever trauma has been experienced in one generation gets passed down to the next. That's why when I see the sun or the moon or a ruling planet posited in the 12th house, I will often ask and make it clear that I'm just asking because this is the question I always ask, if there's a history of depression, of alcohol abuse, or drug abuse that runs in the family. That's because these are patterns of behavior that can be intergenerational, hence the family secret, the skeletons in the family closet. People with these placements have often told me that, yes, there is a pattern of depression or alcoholism or drug abuse in the family history, or that they struggle with it themselves, or they have to come to grips with this pattern in their own life or be overrun by it. In some ways, it's a kind of family curse that's been passed down through the generations. And there are certain charts, certain horoscopes, in which you may be called upon to put to rest this family curse, or at least this family predisposition. Now, the following day, Johny follows Madeline to the Palace of the Legion of Honor, where she sits admiring the portrait of Carlotta, once again with the bouquet of flowers resting next to her on the bench. And she gets up from the portrait and she walks outside, and Johny follows her outside. She gets in her car and she starts driving, but she's not driving to the old house today. On this day, she drives towards the Golden Gate Bridge. She drives towards the Presidio. Madeline drives to the fork point at the Presidio, which is beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. And she gets out of her car and she walks. She walks around a wall, and Johny follows her behind the wall, but he's always keeping his distance, always blending in with the shadows or the background. And he sees Madeline standing by the bay. She's wearing a scarf which flutters in the wind, and she's holding the small bouquet of flowers, and she's looking down at it. Now, the camera does this gorgeous close-up on the bouquet of flowers, and she's picking the flowers out of the bouquet, and she's tossing them into the San Francisco Bay with a sort of funereal solemnity, reflective, vague, empty, and Johny sort of moves a little bit closer as she does this, and he sort of looks away and he looks back, and then suddenly he sees Madeline jump into the San Francisco Bay. She doesn't dive into it, she just sort of jumps into the water. And Johny immediately rushes to the edge of the water, takes off his jacket and dives into the water, and he sees Madeline there in the water, but she's beginning to sink, and he grabs a hold of her and he struggles with her. The currents in the San Francisco Bay are very, very strong, and he struggles and he swims and he gets her up out of the water. He gets her up onto the steps that lead down to this part of the wharf, and he picks her up. And remember, her outfit is completely full of water, so she's heavier than she would usually be as just a person. and he takes her back to his car and props her up against the seat. She's totally passed out. She's totally unconscious. So Johny takes her back to his apartment. And indeed, the next scene begins with Johny like a sweater and a shirt, and he's sitting on the couch. And the camera pans across his apartment, and we see different pieces of Madeline's clothing drying off. And finally, we see the open door to his bedroom, which is way across the room. Johnny's keeping a gentlemanly distance. And you see Madeline asleep in his bed. She's murmuring to herself. She's shaking her head. She's dreaming, and she's talking in her sleep. And Johny is observing her. Suddenly the phone rings, and Johny picks up the phone, and he says, yes, no, she's here. Let me call you back. He looks up, and she's like completely awake in his bed. And she's completely awake in his bed, looking startled. And it's this magnificent moment. She doesn't know where she is, but she sees that it's a man, and she's in a bed, and she's got no clothing on. So it's kind of like, you stay away from me. What have you done to me? What's going on here? I mean, so it's this like, did you do something to me? And also like, where am I? And she's totally here. And there's an alertness to Madeline that we haven't really seen when she's been walking and driving. When she's been walking and driving, it's almost a meandering sense. But here she's very alert. She's like a cat. And Kim Novak, who plays Madeline, looks like a cat. And there's a kind of like fierceness to her eyes. And Johny begins to settle her down. He says, listen, you fell into the San Francisco Bay. And she's like, I fell into the San Francisco Bay. And he's like, yes. And I dove in after you and fished you out. I fell into the San Francisco Bay and you fished me out? Yes. And I brought you back here. Now, don't worry. Your clothes are drying, and I did the best that I could to dry your hair. And she sort of clutches the sheets over herself because clearly Johny took all of her clothes off in order to dry everything. And she's in his bed naked. And he's like, but everything's okay. And the phone rings again. And he's like, but I've got to get this phone call. He goes and picks it up. And it's Gavin. It's her husband. And he's like, yes, she's all right. Like I told you before, she jumped into the bay. And now, and he looks up and Madeline's gone. She's left. She's gone. The following day, Johny goes to follow Madeline again. She gets behind the wheel of her car and she drives around the city. But she's not going to the usual places. She's not going to the flower store. She's not going to the Mission Dolores. She's not going to the Legion of Honor. In fact, there's a difference here. He's used to her driving in a sort of leisurely, meandering pace, but now she seems to be driving around in circles and doesn't look like she knows where she's going. And he's like, where are we going now, Madeline? As he's following her in the car. Then he begins to recognize the neighborhood. And indeed, she has driven and parked her car in front of his apartment. And she gets out in this beautiful white coat. It's so like fabulous. And she has these black gloves and she goes and she takes an envelope out of her purse and she tucks it in his mailbox and turns around and Johny brings his car to a stop. And Johny gets out of the car and he addresses Madeline and he's like, hello there. And she turns around and she's like, well, hello. And he's like, I'm sorry about what happened yesterday. And she's like, no, I'm sorry about what happened yesterday. I've written you a thank you card and a note of apology, and I've left it in your mailbox. And he's like, you have nothing to apologize for. I was walking along and I saw you dive in. And she's like, and you were very heroic to do such a thing. And I'm very, very thankful for that. And she's like, thank you again for rescuing me. And she heads to her car. And Johny asks her, where are you off to now? Shopping? And Madeline's like, wandering. And Johnny's like, shall we wander together? And Madeline responds, but only one person is a wanderer. Two people are always going somewhere. It's such a great exchange. It's so flirty between the two of them. And, Johnny's like, well, you mind if I join you? And she's like, sure. And so Johny hops into the car and she's behind the wheel. And she's driving, to Lord knows where she's driving to, but Johnny's into it and he's enjoying her company immensely, and he gets to spend time with her up close, which he enjoys. And what they do is that they drive. They drive for a long period of time outside the city. They leave the city and they drive to a redwood forest. I don't know if you've been to the redwood forest in California, but it's majestic. It's like a wooden cathedral of trees where the light just sort of streams down between the trees, kind of like a stained glass window, but there's no stained glass window. It's coming through the pillars of the redwood trees themselves, of the sequoia themselves. And as they enter into the forest, Madeline in her white coat, she becomes very quiet. She's not talkative or flirty like she was before. She's absorbed and she's different. And Johny, in true Gemini fashion, just is a companion. He's a buddy. This is one of the wonderful things, by the way, of Geminis. It's like Gemini is kind of like the hangout sign, but it's more kind of like a sign that you can go from one place to another with. They'll walk beside you. They'll stay conversational if you're conversational. If you're quiet, they'll be quiet. So there's an easygoing nature to people born under Gemini. And this is one of the reasons I'm convinced that the character of Scotty is a Gemini. He has this easygoing, companionable nature, something you see with the Mercury signs, Gemini and Virgo. Madeline is more Neptunian. She's more mysterious. She's vague. She's enigmatic. She's hard to figure out. And in this scene, she's especially hard to figure out because suddenly Madeline, who we got just a glimpse of, being flirty and thankful, has now disappeared. And the expression on her face is very vague and it's very empty. Now, they come to a display in this redwood tree forest of the trunk of a redwood. Actually, it's a cross section that's been taken out. And redwood trees, like all trees, have rings. And rings in the trunk really denote the age. Now, on a typical tree, you get a few rings and that's about it. But with a redwood tree, which is centuries old, you get not only a huge slab of a cross section, which they're looking at in this display, but there are rings and rings and rings and rings because it's been around for centuries. And this display has different prominent years that have been tagged that record significant dates in history. And Madeline becomes entranced, completely absorbed with this cross section of the wood of the tree that's been put on display. And she runs her fingers over the glass and she points to these lines that are near the edge, but not there. And she says, here is where I was born. And there is where I died. It was only a moment for you. You took no notice of me. Johny, realizing that she's gotten quite morbid, says, let's walk out in the light here for a moment. And so they walk out in the light and they get in the car and they drive again and they drive down the coast and there's a patch of water. Madeline gets out of the car to look at it and Johny follows her, but Madeline can tell that he's nervous. He's nervous about her being near the water. And she turns to him. She's like, are you nervous about something? Like, what's wrong? And he's like, well, I feel responsible for you now. You know what the Chinese say. Once you've saved a person's life, you're responsible for it forever. So I'm committed. I have to know what you see when you go off into these dreamy trances of yours. And Madeline, looking out over the ocean dreamily, says, I see a room. I'm sitting alone. Then I see a grave, an open grave waiting for me. And then there's a tower and a bell and a garden below. And then suddenly she's like, oh, Scotty, I'm not mad. I'm not mad, am I? I don't want to die. But Scotty, there's someone within me. There's someone within me who says I must die. Oh, Scotty, don't let me go. And so Scotty holds her close and the two of them kiss. And she says, don't leave me. Stay with me. Stay with me. So afterwards, Scotty goes and he drops by Midge's apartment. He's promised her that he's going to take her out for dinner and a movie that night. And so he enters, and Midge is working on an easel again. So Johny just assumes it's another commercial drawing or something like that. And she finishes what she's doing, and she puts a little cloth over the easel. And she asks Johny, "Where do you go all day?" And he's like, "Where do I go all day?" And she's like, "You're hard to get in touch with. Where do you go all day?" And he's like, "I don't know, wandering." And so Midge says, "Well, while you've been out wandering, I've been getting back in touch with my first love, painting." And Johnny's like, "Oh, that sounds good. What are you painting?" And she says, "A portrait." "A portrait?" And she's like, "Yes, a portrait. Do you want to come see it?" And so Johnny's like, "Sure." And he gets up, and Midge takes off the cloth. And of course, it's a portrait of Carlotta, that Midge has studied in great detail. But instead of Carlotta's face looking up at Johny, it's Midge's face, smiling, holding the bouquet of flowers with her horned rimmed glasses, looking up at Johny. And Midge is like, "What do you think of it?" And Johnny's like, "Oh, oh, no, no." And she's like, Johny, what's wrong?" And he's like, "Let's get together for that dinner and that movie another time." And so Johny leaves, and Midge is left alone, and she says, "Marjorie Wood, you idiot!" And she pulls at her hair, and she says, "Stupid, stupid, stupid." It's a wonderful moment from the film. I mean, it gets me every time laughing. I love Midge, okay? It's like Midge is clearly one of my favorite characters in this film, but what it shows is that the difference between the Mercury and the Neptune, between the Virgo and this Pisces world. And as you know, Virgo and Pisces are opposite one another on the zodiacal wheel. Okay, they're in opposite signs. The Virgo world is a landlocked world, and it's a world of practicality and of knowing things. And it's also a world of great cleverness and humor. Opposite Virgo is the ocean, the oceanic depths of Pisces. This is the world of mystery. This is the world of enigma. Midge is clearly in the fact-finding zodiac sign of Virgo. And what we have here is really a juxtaposition of mysteries. This idea that clues are being left for the reader that they can follow, clues are even in plain sight, and that at the end of the mystery, either you can come up with the answer, or when the detective comes up with the answer, you're like, "Oh, okay, that's what it was, and I see where they found that." So this idea of following the clues, of following the facts, is very Virgoan, okay, deduction. The opposite sign to Virgo is Pisces, and this is the realm of the mysterious. This is the realm where things cannot be explained. It's mysteries that are evocative, mysteries that can't be explained or deduced. You know something is going on, and you're following the trail of clues and what's being left behind, but they're like footprints. They're like footprints on the sand of the beach. And as the waves come in, they cover those footprints and they dissolve them. So what Johnny's following here, no sooner do the footprints appear, but the waves come in and they dissolve it. He's drawn in to the mystery of Madeline. He's drawn into the enigma of Madeline, but it's more than just the mystery at this point. He feels that Madeline is drowning, not literally, but figuratively, that there is something at work that comes into her presence, that comes into her being. He's seen it. He's witnessed it himself with the trances. And now, having fallen in love with her with that kiss, where they demonstrate the feelings that they have for one another, Johny is intent on saving her. But the person that Johny has to save her from is herself. The next morning, there's a buzzing at the door, and it's early morning. Johny is sitting on the couch asleep. That's where he fell asleep the night before, so he's woken up by this buzzing. And he comes to the door, and the sun hasn't really risen yet. So it's very dark. He opens up the door and he sees this dark silhouette, and it's Madeline, and she steps out of the shadows into the light, and she looks up at him beseechingly. She's had a dream, and she wants to tell Johny about it. And Johny asks, "What did you see?" And Madeline says, "It was the tower again, and the bell, and the old Spanish village. Clear. So very clear for the first time. All of it. It was a village square with trees and an old whitewashed church with a cloister. Across the green, there was a big wooden house with a porch and shutters and a balcony above a small garden, and next to it was a livery stable with old carriages lined up inside. And Johny says, "Go on." And Madeline says, "At the end of the green, there was a whitewashed storehouse with a lovely pepper tree at the corner." And Johny says, "And an old wooden hotel from the old California days? And a saloon, dark, low ceilings with hanging oil lamps?" And Madeline, a bit surprised, says, "Yes." And Johny says, "It's all there. It's not a dream. You've been there before." Madeline, "No, never." Johny, "Madeline, 100 miles south of San Francisco, there's an old Spanish mission, San Juan Bautista, it's called, and it's been preserved exactly as it was 100 years ago, as a museum. What frightened you?" Madeline, "What frightened me? I stood alone on the green, looking for something, and then I started to walk to the church. But then the darkness closed in, and I was alone in the dark, being pulled into darkness, and I fought to wake up." Johny, "You're going to be all right, Madeline. You've given me something to work on. I'm going to take you down to that mission this afternoon, and when we see it, you'll remember when you saw it before, and it will finish your dream. It will destroy it, I promise you." So that afternoon, they drive down to San Juan Bautista, the mission of San Juan Bautista, and Johny is elated. He's so excited because at last he's got something tangible that he can show Madeline, which is somehow triggering these visions inside of her. There's no ghost, there's no past life, there's nothing that's stalking her. She's been to this place before. It's not a vision, it's an actual place. And Johny feels that if he can show her the actual place that she was at, then that will unlock the secret. It's a kind of like, I don't know, Helen Keller moment. Remember that moment in The Miracle Worker where Helen Keller's teacher, Annie, is trying to reach Helen Keller in her darkness, and she goes to the pump and she pumps out water and she holds Helen's hand under the water, and Helen's like, "Water," because she links water with the sensation. I mean, this is certainly what's fueling Johny. Like we're going to go down to this mission. We're going to see that it's a real place. Maybe you had a traumatic experience as a child or something like that, but you're not being haunted, okay? You're not being forced to kill yourself or something like that. We're going to see that there is a physical reason why you're having these flashbacks and these visions. You're not being haunted. You're not being stalked by a ghostly character. You're not being revisited by a past life. This is all basic stuff that takes place here in the world. So they get down to the mission, and Johny takes her to the livery stable, and he's like, pointing out different things and saying, she must have been here before, maybe as a child, and seen these things. And Madeline is responding very vaguely and sort of muttering things about a nun from 100 years ago or something along those lines. And Johnny's getting all like, no, you see, this is all stuff here. You must have seen this before when you were younger. And don't go there, or don't go to those haunted trances. And she's kind of like looking more Neptunian and Piscean and haunted in her trance. And Johny just grabs her and he says, try for me. And he kisses her. He kisses her with a desperation. And he says, "I love you, Madeline." And she's like, "I love you too." And he's kissing her like a prince kissing a princess. He's trying to rise her from her slumber, bring her back from this world that she's slipping into. And he's holding her and he's like, "I love you, I love you." And Madeline says, "I love you too, but it's too late, too late." And there's this amazing shot of Johny sort of covering her with kisses, and Madeline's looking past him, and she's beginning to sort of push him away. And he's like, no, we're together. He's drawing her close. And Madeline says, "No, it's too late. There's something I must do." And Johnny's like, "There's nothing you must do. No one possesses you, Madeline. You're safe with me." And she's like, "No, it's too late." And Madeline breaks away from Johny, and she runs until he catches her, and he turns her around, and Madeline looks at him, and it's really growling. She says, "Look, it's not fair. It's too late. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. It shouldn't have happened." And Johny's like, "It had to happen. We're in love. Madeline, listen to me. You believe that I love you. And if you lose me, I want you to know I loved you. And I wanted to go on loving you." And Johny's like, "I won't lose you. Madeline, let me go into the church alone." She kisses him, and then she looks up at the bell tower, which is looming over the green, and she rushes into the church. And Johnny's like, "Oh, no, no, no," and he rushes after her because he knows exactly what's going on. Johny follows her into the church. He enters the church and he doesn't see her anywhere. He looks to the right and there's a baptismal font. And then he looks to the left and he sees these stairs leading up to the bell tower, to the belfry. And he can hear her footsteps on the stairs. So he races up the steps after Madeline. And you can see that she's just right in front of him as they race up this kind of spiral of stairs. But then suddenly Johny stops and he looks down and he's seized by the acrophobia and he sees the floor dropping out from beneath him. But no, he can't stop. So he continues to race up the stairs, but he stops again and he can't help it. He looks down and the floor is falling further. And in that moment, he hears a terrible scream and he looks out the window and he sees Madeline falling down and he just is paralyzed with absolute fear. And he just doesn't know what to do. And at that moment, the camera pulls away and we see Madeline's body on a lower ceiling of the bell tower of this mission, San Juan Bautista. And she's dead. She's clearly dead. And we see from one side, from a bird's eye view, the priest and the gardener inspecting the corpse of Madeline. And then on the other side, we see Johny departing the church and departing the scene of the death. There's an inquest, of course, and it's blistering. Johny isn't on trial, but everyone is there to give testimony as to what had happened. And the judge does an incredibly harsh critique of Johny, in which he's like, saying, why was this investigator who had nothing to do with psychology following around a woman who is obviously delusional and suicidal? And he said, I suppose we should congratulate you on having rescued her from her first suicide, but because of your fear of heights, the same fear in which a police officer died on your account, your fear of heights froze you at the moment when she most needed rescuing, when she was throwing herself off the tower. And now, Mr. Ferguson, it seems as though the second suicide was more successful than the first. Those are two deaths that you have on your conscience. Obviously, the jury finds that the reason of Madeline's death was suicide. Johny is the witness, even though he left the scene of the death, which the judge also chides him for, and they render their verdict and the inquiry is adjourned. It's at that moment that Gavin comes over and apologizes to Johny for the harsh critique of the judge. The judge was really blistering in his critique. And he tells Johny that he's leaving San Francisco and going perhaps to Europe. He needs to get away because memories of living here just bring up Madeline and he can't bear to live with it. And then he says to Johny, you and I both know who killed Madeline. A couple of days later, it's Johnny's turn to visit a gravesite. And this time it's the gravesite of Madeline. And he's burdened with grief. You can see it in his physicality. He's burdened with grief and he's burdened with guilt. And that night he has a dream. And this is an extraordinary dream sequence that takes place in the film Vertigo with brilliant music by Bernard Herrmann. In the dream that he has, you see Johny asleep, but he's restless in his sleep, and he suddenly sits up in bed and he glares at the camera. And what he sees is the small bouquet of flowers that Madeline was carrying around. The flower petals fly in all directions to reveal Carlotta Valdez, standing between Gavin and Johny in front of a window. It's the sort of window that you would see in a Spanish mission church room. Carlotta's head is on Gavin's shoulder, but she lifts it from Gavin's shoulder and she turns and she looks at Johny accusingly. It's a very bitter look. She's dressed just like in her portrait, And then suddenly the dream switches to the portrait. But instead of the portrait, we see Carlotta in the same exact pose. She's holding the small bouquet of flowers and she's looking up out of the portrait like she did before. But this time, we focus on the necklace. The camera begins to do a close-up on the necklace, this amber necklace, which is hanging around Carlotta's neck in the portrait. The dream then switches to Scotty. Scotty is walking towards us, searching for something. He's lost and he's sort of looking at the camera and he's surrounded in black, like the black that Madeline was describing. But as he keeps walking, suddenly the black background is replaced by the Mission Dolores Cemetery. And you see the graves of the Mission Dolores behind him and he's walking through them and he's walking towards something. What is he walking towards? We see that it's the grave of Carlotta Valdez, the grave that Madeline stood in front of for hours at a time before. But the grave of Carlotta Valdez is there, but it's an open grave. It's an open grave like the open grave that Madeline was describing. He sees this open grave and he falls forward into it. But it's a bottomless pit. It's a bottomless pit of darkness that he's falling through. And then suddenly the darkness begins to dissipate and we see the top of the church and we see Scotty's body in silhouette, but it's sort of limp, almost as if it's been dragged out of the water and it's falling slowly down. We see it from behind him. It's falling slowly down to the roof of the mission and he hits that roof and Scotty wakes up with a complete startled, terrified expression on his face. In the next scene, Scotty is in a mental hospital where he's being visited by Midge. He sits in a chair looking completely vacant, looking completely lost, the sort of waking somnambulism that Madeline was walking through as she visited these different places when she was still alive. Now, Midge is playing a Mozart record on the record player, and she reports to Scotty that the reason she's doing this is because it's music therapy, and that music therapy is aimed at calming his nerves and somehow waking him out of the stupor that he's in. And Midge comments, "It's music therapy. I have here music for dipsomaniacs, music for melancholomaniacs, and music for hypochondriacs. I wonder, what would happen if someone in the office got all of the patient's files mixed up?" It's a joke, and it's a joke that doesn't really work. She turns to Johny in a moment, and it's a singular moment. It's a moment that echoes the same moment that Johny had turned to Madeline. And she says to Johny, who's in a daze, "Johny, please try. Try. You're not lost. I'm here. You don't even know that I'm here, do you? But I'm here, Johny, oh. I'm here for you, just the same." Johny eventually recovers, but he's a haunted man. Like Madeline, he goes to all of these places looking for her. He goes to her apartment and he sees a woman dressed in a similar outfit that Madeline was wearing when he first saw her enter the green car. And he goes rushing towards her, but he sees that it's not Madeline. And the woman is a little bit frightened. And he's like, "Where did you get this car?" And she's like, "I bought it from this fellow named Gavin Elster when his wife died. He didn't want to be reminded of painful memories." And Johnny's like, "Oh, okay." He goes to the Palace Legion of Fine Arts, and he sees a woman sitting in front of the portrait of Carlotta, and he approaches her, and the woman looks up startled. And of course, it's not Madeline. So you get this feeling that he's haunting these places, that he's in the exact headspace that Madeline was in before, and that he's experiencing for himself what it's like to live this half life, this life of walking in a waking sleep. And of course, when he's standing outside the florist shop, Podesta Baldocchi, looking through the window, and he happens to be looking at a small bouquet of flowers that looks exactly like the flowers that Carlotta was holding in her portrait, he looks up from his Neptunian days and he sees this group of young ladies who are all walking together and they're laughing and they're very lively. And they're sales girls who are walking home after a day of work. And he looks at them sort of absently and he fixes his eyes on one. And she happens to look exactly like Madeline. Now, physically, she doesn't look a thing like Madeline. Her hair is dark. She's wearing this loud, very green shirt and skirt. And she's got, very sort of loud red lipstick and cheap earrings and things like that. But nevertheless, her profile is the same exact profile as Madeline's. So what does he do? He hangs in the background. The girls all say goodnight. And he follows this one shopping girl, the one whose profile resembles Madeline. He follows her through the streets until she arrives at her home, which is at the Hotel Empire. And he watches her go in, and he waits a couple of moments. And just like when Madeline opened up the doors to that old house that she had visited, the shop girl has lifted up the window to her hotel. She overlooks the city, and she disappears. She disappears from view. So Johny gets her apartment number and shows up at her door knocking. I guess he pulled the same trick that he pulled with the other manager of the hotel, where he told them that he's an investigator, a detective. And I guess back in those days, everyone was really quick and easy with giving out names and room numbers. Anyway, Johny shows up at her door and he knocks on the door and she opens it. And she looks at him like, do I know you? And he's like, listen, you don't know me. And she's like, yeah. But can I ask you a couple of questions? And she's like, what, are you with the Gallipo or something? And he's like, just a couple of questions. I won't take up much of your time. And she's like, what's going on here? What do you want from me? And he's like, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. I just want to sit down and I want to talk. Hey, you're not looking to pull any hanky-panky, are you? I mean, I've got a loud voice, and when I scream, everyone's going to hear me on this floor. And he's like, no, shh. There's nothing to scream about. I just want to ask you a couple of questions, please. Just a moment or two of your time. And she's like, okay. I mean, this isn't a pickup or anything like that, is it? And he's like, no, it's not a pickup at all. And she's like, well, what do you want to know? And it's like, I want to know your name. Judy Barton. And how long have you lived in San Francisco? Did you grow up here? I've lived in San Francisco for 3 years. Oh, where do you come from? Salinas, Kansas. And he's like, no, that can't be possible. She's like, it is possible. I'm Judy Barton. I've lived here 3 years and I'm from Salinas, Kansas. Now, okay, are you satisfied? And he's like, no, really? And she's like, do you want to see my ID? And she takes out her ID and she's like, Judy Barton, Salinas, Kansas. My driver's license number is, and she recites it. And she's like, she studies him for a moment. And in that moment, Judy's manner goes from brusque to sensitive as they begin to talk. And she says, I get approached by a lot of men. And a lot of times they will tell me that I remind them of someone, like maybe it's an ex-girlfriend or a long-lost love or something like that. So I don't know. Do I remind you of her? And he's like, and she's like, wow, you've got it bad, don't you? And he's like, and she says, do I really look like her? And Johny nods. She looks at him and she's like, she's dead, isn't she? And Johnny's like, will you come to dinner with me tonight? Just dinner. And she's like a blind date? And he's like, no, just dinner. I've had a lot of those blind dates. And to be honest, I've been picked up before too, but yeah, you seem like a good guy. I could go with you to dinner. And he's like, how about if I come back in a half an hour? And she's like, give me an hour. I got to change and freshen my face. And he's like, I'll be back here in an hour. And she's like, okay. And she closes the door. And it's this wonderful moment in the film. She closes the door and she turns around and she looks at the camera. And you can see that she's distressed. And what we're then taken into by Hitchcock is a flashback. We see the tower. We see the tower at the mission San Juan Bautista, and it's looming. It's very, very tall. It's very, very high. It's very frightening looking. And we see Madeline racing towards the door, and she opens the door and she enters the church. We see Johny racing right after her, and he's on her tail. And Madeline is racing up the stairs as they spiral on up to the top of this bell tower. And Johny tries to follow her, but he stops because he's frozen with fear. But the flashback continues because this is Judy's flashback and not Johny's. And so we see Judy, dressed as Madeline Elster, push open the trap door, and she looks up, and there's Gavin. And Gavin's holding the unconscious body of his wife, who is also blonde, with her hair in a French twist, and dressed in a gray suit, which happens to be the same gray suit that Judy, dressed as Madeline, is wearing. And he throws the unconscious body of his wife over the side of the tower, and Judy screams, she cries out. And at that moment, Gavin grabs Judy and he covers her mouth, and she's trying to pull herself away from him, and he covers her mouth and he forces them into the shadows. And now we know that Judy is not only a witness to the murder of Mrs. Elster, but she's also an accomplice as well. Judy immediately goes to her closet and she starts taking out clothes. And she takes out the gray suit that she was wearing on the day that Madeline Elster died, and she puts it back in the closet, gathers some more clothes, a suitcase, and she throws them into the suitcase. She's packing her bags. She's ready to leave town. She wants nothing more to do with any of this. But then she stops. She stops and she writes Johny a letter in which she explains everything that had happened, that she had been taken in by Gavin Elster, that she was his mistress, and that she was rehearsed to play this role. She didn't know why she was playing this role, but she was rehearsed to play it, except there was a problem with it, and the problem was that she fell in love with Johny. She really, really legitimately fell in love with Johny, but she didn't know how to get out of her situation. But she's confessing to Johny that it wasn't his fault, and that they were part of a murder that neither of them signed on for. And she wants to stay and make Johny love her for who she is, Judy Barton. And that's why she's staying. And then she stops writing this note and she realizes this is ridiculous. This man's going to not believe any of it. It's wild. It's crazy. Or if he does, there's this whole thing with the murder, and I don't know how to answer that. And she tears up the letter, and she vows to herself that she's going to make Johny fall in love with who she is now. So the two of them go to dinner that night, and they go to dinner the following day, and the day after that, they're dating. It's a little bit on the compulsive side, but Judy doesn't really mind, and things are going well. Things are wonderfully romantic between the two of them. But Judy can tell that Johny is distracted, vague, remote, that he has his mind on other things. And Johny also wants certain things. Like, he doesn't want Judy going to work. He wants Judy to give up her job. And he wants to buy things for Judy. He wants to buy things like flowers and clothes, and maybe even move her to a better apartment. Judy's kind of like, oh, that sounds nice. She's sort of into it. But what she begins to recognize when he suddenly buys her flowers is that the flowers that he buys her are the same small bouquet that Madeline was carrying, or that when he buys her clothes, that when he goes out to buy her clothes and she's getting a fitting and she's all sorts of excited about the fitting, he's asking her to be fitted for a gray suit, like the gray suit Madeline wore when she died, or a black dress, like the black dress Madeline was wearing at the night of Ernie's when Scotty first saw her. And the shoes have to be the same, and the handbags have to be the same. They have to be the same as Madeline. And what we see is that Judy knows all too well why he's doing this. And the way that Kim Novak plays the response is so beautiful, because on one hand, she's like, stop doing this, which is what any girlfriend would say if she was going out with someone who was trying to dress her like someone he was in love with who died. But at the same time, there's a pain that Judy has and a guilt. She knows why he's doing it. He's trying to create Madeline. And Judy knows full well he never met Madeline, and this is what's so Neptunian, okay? He never met the woman that he's in love with, and that he's standing in front of the woman he fell in love with, but he doesn't recognize her because she doesn't appear dressed in the way that Madeline did. And this is so Neptunian because it asks the question, is it a figment of the imagination that he's fallen in love with, or an idealized love? Has the grief blinded him to the true love that's standing there in front of him? And it also talks about how we imbue fantasies or memories with a life of their own, which is a very Neptunian influence. Neptune has the ability to give life to a fantasy. It's not an hallucination. You just know that something should look a certain way, smell a certain way, be a certain way, and you're trying to re-invoke that. That's probably the best way of describing it. And Madeline, who I see as being the Pisces in the piece, she understands who Johny fell in love with and that she's in competition with that ideal lost love. And finally, one day she confronts him and she says, "Why are you doing this? What good will it do?" And Johnny's like, "Well, what's wrong? It can't make that much difference to you if you dress a certain way. And Judy says, "You don't even want to touch me. Couldn't you like me the way that I am?" And Johny holds her tenderly. He feels bad. He realizes that he's been a little bit odd, and he notices her hair while she's crying. And he murmurs, the color of your hair." And Judy, crying, pushes Johny away from her. And she's ferociously angry. And Johny just looks at her with the most lost expression on his face. And Judy's expression changes, it softens. And she says, "If I let you change me, will it do it? If I do it, will you love me?" And Johny says, "Yes." And Judy, "Okay, then I'll do it." And so Judy agrees to everything. She agrees to wear the clothes. She agrees to the shoes, the handbag. She agrees to her hair being colored blonde, just the way that Johny likes it. And so she tells Johny she's going to be at the beauty salon for a long time, and she'll come back to the apartment and present herself to him. And so Johny waits for her at the apartment, and he's restless. It's getting late. And he opens up the apartment door and he stands out there looking out the hallway. He hears the elevator and he sees Judy emerge from around the corner, and she's wearing the gray suit with the white blouse that Madeline was wearing when she died. And her hair is that exact same blonde color that it was. The eyebrows are the same. The lipstick is the same. And she approaches him, and you can just see the relief and the love in his eyes. But then he stops as she gets closer and he's like, but I gave them specific instructions at the hair salon. I told them that your hair needs to be up and twisted in a bun." And Judy walks past him into the inner apartment and she's like, "I told them that I liked it just as it is. I think actually the hair looks much better around my face. It frames it beautifully. Done up in a bun, it doesn't look so good. I didn't like it, Johny. But how do I look? How do you like?" And he's like, and she can tell that he doesn't like the way that she appears. And she's like, all right, give me a moment. I'll go into the bathroom and I'll make the adjustment." And Johny waits there outside the closed bathroom door as she's inside. And here's this wonderful moment that Truffaut, in his interview with Hitchcock, describes as a reverse striptease. There's this eroticism, there's this longing, there's this tension, almost this kind of fever, but it's not a striptease where Judy's taking off different items of clothing. It's a reverse striptease. She's putting on each item of clothing that she once wore. So when the bathroom door opens and Judy emerges, her hair is perfect. She looks exactly like Madeline. And the camera comes back to Johnny's face, and you see this longing and you see these tears almost in his eyes, because Madeline, as she approaches him, has come back from the dead. She's back, and he can't believe it. It's the longing, but it's also the love and the passion that he feels for her that we see exhibited in his expression. And Kim Novak plays it beautifully. She looks at him knowingly, and there's almost a kind of like hypnotic glare of a cat as she approaches him. One night, a few days later, they're getting ready for dinner. Actually, Judy's getting ready for dinner. Johnny's sitting in a chair and he's watching her. She's putting up her blonde hair in the way that he likes it. She's wearing the black dress, the dinner dress that Madeline was wearing the night that he first met her. And she's getting ready. And he's like, "Can I kiss you?" And she's like, "No, you can't kiss me." And he's like, "Why can't I kiss you?" And she's like, "I've just put my face on and you'll muss it." And he's like, "What's wrong with mussing your face a bit?" And she's like, "I want to look beautiful for you, darling. And we're going to dinner. So just give me a moment here." She's putting on earrings and she's getting ready, and she takes out a piece of jewelry. It's a necklace that she's putting around her neck, but she's having some difficulty with it. She can't really get the clasp right. And she's like, "Scotty, can you come over here and help me with the necklace?" Remember, he interchanges between Scotty and Johny, so now he's Scotty. So she's like, "Scotty, can you come over here and help me with the necklace?" And he's like, "Sure." I mean, Scotty at this point is an old pro at how to dress a woman. So he goes behind and he's fiddling with the lock on the necklace and trying to get it right. And he does, and he's got it on right. And he's like, "How's that look?" And she's like, "Fine." And at that moment, he glances in the mirror. And it is the amber necklace. It is Carlotta's amber necklace that Judy is putting on. And he freezes. The world has transformed again. The world has changed again. And he goes back and he goes towards his chair to pick up the jacket. And she's like, "Where shall we go to dinner?" And Johnny's like, "Oh, I know a wonderful place where we can go to dinner." "You do?" "Yes, it just opened. It's supposed to be really quite wonderful. Everyone's raving about it. It gets excellent reviews." And she's like, "Where is it?" And he's like, "Oh, it's down the coast a little bit, a little south of San Francisco. Not much of a drive. We can get there in maybe 20 minutes." And she's like, "I'm famished, but okay." And she's like, "All right, I lied about mussing. You can kiss me here on the cheek." And he does. And they leave. And so they're driving, and it's a long drive. And Judy's looking rather restless. She's famished. She's hungry. She wants something to eat. But she notices as they're driving that she recognizes where they're going. And she figures out quite quickly where they're going. And she's like, "Where are we going, Johny?" "We'll be there soon." And indeed, they arrive very soon at the mission San Juan Bautista. And Judy is completely frozen in the passenger seat, like she's not moving at all. And Johny comes around to her side and he opens up the door and she's like, "Why are we here?" Johnny's like, "I want you to get out of the car." And she's like, "I'm not getting out of the car. I want to go to the restaurant. I want to have dinner. What are we doing here?" And Johnny's like, "I need you to be Madeline for one more time." And she's like, "What?" And he's like, "I want to stop being haunted. I want you to walk up those stairs, Judy. I want you to walk up those stairs and I'll follow." And so Judy is torn and she's frightened and she's paralyzed with fear, but she doesn't really follow Johny. He's taken her by the wrist and he's practically dragging her to the church. They open the door and they go to the stairs. And he says, "What I want you to do is I want you to walk in front of me up these stairs." And so Judy does. And in this beautiful moment, which is the reverse of Orpheus and Eurydice, in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, where he descends down into the underworld to retrieve her soul, Orpheus is told that he can retrieve her soul and she will come back to life as long as when he's leading her back up to the surface world, he doesn't turn around and look at her. That if Orpheus looks at her, she'll be lost to him forever. Here we see the reverse. It's Judy as Eurydice who's leading the way up the stairs. And it's Johny who's so troubled and sweating, and he's part pulling and pushing on her as he goes up the stairs. He's really struggling, and you can tell. They go up a number of steps, and she stops and she looks back, And he's panting, and he looks down, and again, the floor drops from underneath him, and he pushes her, and she continues walking up the stairs, and they get up quite a bit further, and Johny stops again, and he's clearly sweating, and he's clearly upset, but he's containing himself. He's holding himself. And Judy turns around and looks at him, and he says, "This was as far as I could get, but you went on. Remember? The necklace, Madeline. That was the slip. I remembered the necklace." At that point, Judy realizes that he understands everything, and she tries to run back down the steps, but Johny physically blocks her on the stair. And Judy says, "Let me go." And Johny says, "No, no, we're going up to the tower, Madeline." And Judy says, "No, you can't. You're afraid." And Johny says, Now we'll see. We'll see if I'm afraid. This is my second chance." And Judy says, "Scotty, please." And Johny says, "But you knew that day. You knew that day I wouldn't be able to follow you. Who was up there? Elster and his wife?" And Judy almost hisses, "Yes." And Johny says, "And she was the one who died. The real wife, not you. And you were the copy, the counterfeit. Was she dead or alive when he threw her from the tower?" Judy, "He had broken her neck." Johny, "So you played the wife very well, Judy. He made you over, just like I made you over. Only he did it better. Not only the clothes and the hair, but the looks and the manner, and the words, and those beautifully phony trances. And then you jumped into the bay. I bet you're a wonderful swimmer. Did he train you? Did he rehearse you? Did he tell you exactly what to do, what to say? Oh, you were a very apt pupil, weren't you? A very apt pupil. But why did you pick on me? Why me?" Judy, "Because of your accident. Johny, I was a setup, wasn't I? Following you around, saving you from suicide, freezing on the stairs while he hurled his wife's body. The real Madeline." Johny then stops at the top of the stairs, but it's such an extraordinary moment. He's at the top of the stairs with the trapdoor above him, but what he's feeling is triumphant. He has climbed these stairs and he hasn't frozen. He has climbed these stairs and he hasn't faltered. He hasn't collapsed. And he says, "I made it." And he opens up the trap door. And Judy's like, "What are you going to do?" And Johny says, "We're going to look at the scene of the crime." And he drags her up those last few stairs, and they enter the belfry. A belfry is where the bell is, with open windows on four sides of it. And Johny says, "And then you were his girl. What happened to you? Did he ditch you? He knew he was safe, with all of his wife's money and power. Did he give you anything?" And Judy says, "Some money." And Johny, "And the necklace? That was where you made your mistake, Judy. You shouldn't keep souvenirs of a killing. You shouldn't have been that sentimental. I loved you so, Madeline." And Judy says, "I was safe when you found me. You couldn't prove anything. When I saw you, Johny, when I saw you, I couldn't run away. I loved you so. I walked into danger, let you change me, because I loved you, Johny. Oh, Scotty, please." And at that moment, he takes her into his arms, and they kiss, and they hold each other. But at that moment, a dark figure emerges from the shadows. And Judy sees it, and she panics, and she breaks out of Scotty's embrace, and she rushes to escape. And we hear a voice say, "I heard voices." And then we hear a scream that trails into silence as Judy plunges to her death. You see, because she misjudged the belfry and she rushed off the edge and she fell. She fell to her death, just like Madeline did before her. And the nun crosses herself and says, Lord, have mercy. And then she reaches for the rope and she rings the bell. She rings the bell in the night to summon help. And we see Scotty as he stands at the edge of the tower, looking down, his body framed against the windowless opening that allows the sound of the bell to toll. And the opening that frames his body so perfectly looks exactly like a gravestone behind him as he looks down, realizing that he has lost his love twice. That haunting is very much a part of Neptune, its spectral presence, the way that it teases our imagination and our feelings of longing. Neptune rules over dreams, symbolic dreams, dreams in which we're trying to figure out what is being told to us. It's not a regular night's dream, which is kind of a mishmash of the events before, but Neptune is one of those visceral dreams, if you've ever had them, in which you are absolutely living there in the dream itself, and that the symbolism doesn't seem so bewildering or puzzling. If anything, the symbolism of the dream is almost prophetic in a way. There's a kind of inevitability to the dream as it's being played out. It's something that people describe a lot in recurring dreams that they have, that there's this resonance of meaning that if they could only decipher it. It's that haunted presence. It's that longing to understand the imagery that brings Johny into Madeline's life. I mean, one can say it's because he rescued her from suicide. And so, as he said, according to the Chinese saying, he's bound to her, he's responsible for her. But into his meandering life, into his life in which he's retired from the police force and he doesn't really have anything to do with himself, comes Madeline, this wonderful addiction, and he becomes caught up in her wandering, in her meandering, in her lostness, and in trying to rescue her. How many people with strong Neptune in your charts, or with a Pisces sun, or a Pisces moon, or a Pisces ascendant, haven't felt that longing, haven't felt that wanting to rescue a lost soul? It's something that's made light of in a lot of astrology books, but it's made light of in a sort of nervous, uneasy sort of way, because it's making light of a longing. It's making light of a yearning that we have all experienced at some point, and that when it takes hold in your soul, it doesn't let up. There's a longing and a yearning for something that you know that at the end you can never have, but that it's touched your soul. It's inhabiting your soul, and it's filling your mind, and it's filling your dreams. This is also a big part of what Neptune, particularly in the zodiac sign of Pisces, is about. But Neptune also rules over those magical places, those strange interludes where we exist between worlds. We know them a lot as being between worlds after a sleep, when we wake up and we're kind of like after a dream. There's that beautiful musical piece, that classical musical piano piece, which is After a Dream. I think it was composed by Fauré or something like that, where you're kind of neither here nor there. But there are also those strange interludes that appear in our day-to-day lives. Maybe we space out, or we're drawn to something where we lose ourselves over to a reverie. This is also the realm of Neptune. But Neptune rules over the supernatural. It rules over what we call the invisible realm of things. But it's not just the supernatural, like ghosties or strange things that go bump in the night, or any of those slasher films. Although, interestingly enough, Hitchcock years later creates the first slasher film, Psycho. But it's not that. We're in a different realm with Vertigo. We're in a realm of haunting, or being haunted, and the seduction of a haunting, and a sort of giving over, and that something, an invisible presence, is sucking the life out of you. I refer to earlier in Jewish folklore, they have the Dybbuk. There are a lot of night creatures that are described in Jewish folklore that come and haunt the dreams at night and that sort of suck the life or the soul out of someone. In Ireland, these were associated with the Sidhe, which were the spirits of the ocean, and they were seen as the fishermen of souls, that the Sidhe would come out of the oceans and they would fish souls out of people dreaming at night. And because that's when you were vulnerable, and they would take the souls back down into the depths of the ocean. And so that person waking was left soulless. They no longer had that thing that animated them. They were full of a melancholy or listlessness, a sense of loss of balance or of purpose in their lives. And Neptune can rule over that as well. So Johny is drawn into this realm where he falls in love with the perfect woman. And of course, this woman doesn't exist. Now, most people would say, well, whenever you fall in love with the perfect person or the soulmate, they don't exist. But here, it's actually a person who is dressed up as a person who does exist that he never meets, that he never actually falls in love with. And this is the great illusion of Vertigo. This is the great enigma that Hitchcock creates. But Johny is left with a choice at the end of this film. And Midge says, Johny, you need to come back. You need to come back from that phantasmal world and find a place for yourself in the world of the living. Now, psychoanalysis was very well known in the late 1950s when Vertigo comes out. And one of the sort of tropes of psychoanalysis was that the only way to get over trauma was to re-experience that trauma. That if you could re-experience that trauma and cry out, your psyche would almost sort of snap back into place, kind of like a psychic version of going to the chiropractor, that your psyche would snap back into place and you would awake from this thing that was haunting you. You faced what it is you couldn't face. And there have been many films that have been based on that kind of a plot. So what's happening here is that Johny was rescuing Madeline from herself. Okay, Johny was rescuing Madeline from this death wish that she had. You know, he wasn't convinced that she was haunted by a spirit, but that she had a death wish, and Johny wanted her to stay in this world. That's why he's so triumphant when he takes her down to the mission, which ironically is where they were going all along, because that's where the murder is going to be staged. Johny on the stairs is frozen in fear. He leaves after the death of Madeline. He can't face it. He's chastised by the inquest for leaving the scene of the death. He's filled with guilt, shame, remorse, and he's one of the walking emotionally wounded. He's a ghost of his former self. He's taken over, as I said before, the place of Madeline in his own life. So what happens when he recognizes the necklace, and the only reason he would have recognized the necklace is from Carlotta's portrait. When he recognizes the necklace, he puts two together. He takes Madeline back down to the tower, and he forces her up those stairs. The ascent is actually about wakening the mind. It's waking up from the delirium. It's getting to the bottom of the mystery. It's getting to the bottom of the grief, of the shame, of the guilt. It's finding out the truth. So two things are going on. He's ascending to get back to the scene of the crime that he suspects is what had taken place. He's also ascending the stairs to beat his fear of heights, to triumph over it. That's why that part where they're going up the stairs, Judy is pulled in different directions. Part of her is like, you know, guilt, but then part of it is like, you're doing it. I mean, she cares about his salvation. And Judy sees in that a chance for her salvation as well. She didn't plot to murder Madeline Elster. She was brought in. She was as much a stooge as Johny was. She was made to play a role. And she's carried this horrible secret, and she's carried this love for Johny. At last, they can be together. He's going to know what had happened, and he's going to be released from this, and they'll both be released from this. So she goes running into his arms, and Johny quite naturally takes her into his arms. He's always been in love with Judy, Madeline, Madeline, Judy, Judy, Madeline, whoever, this woman. He's always been in love with her. They kiss, but then comes this sepulchral voice from the shadows. I thought I heard voices. And the image rises up almost like a ghost from an open grave, if you think of the open trap door. And Judy screams, terrified, and she runs, but there's nowhere to run to. It's a cramped space, and she runs off the tower. And of course, the figure that emerges, looking like a headstone, almost, if you think of a nun's silhouette, is the nun. And she emerges to cross herself because someone's died and to ring the bell. And Johny is left bereft. This is an interesting place and one that may echo in your life with the sun forming its last conjunction to Neptune in Pisces. Johny has lost his love twice. A love he never met the first time, and a love he did the second time, but there was a guilty secret. There was something tarnished to the two of them. What would Johny have done if he had given in to his feelings? Would he have kept quiet? After all, what was he going to tell the police? That he was a witness to a suicide and now a murder? I mean, what Johny has from this experience is that he's conquered his fear. And like a Gemini, which is ruled after Mercury, which was the herald of the gods, Mercury was the only god who could descend down into the underworld and descend back up into Olympus. No other gods could move between the planes of heaven, earth, and hell and back again like Mercury could. And Johny has done that. So the mind has triumphed. There's a reason, there's a secret, it's been revealed, but at the same time, it's been taken out of his hands. Okay, his love has been taken out of his hands. It was phantasmal. It wasn't really there, and he's lost. So he's gained his mind, I should say, regained his mind, but lost his soul in the bargain. Here at the crossroads, as Neptune prepares to leave the zodiac sign of Pisces and enter the zodiac sign of Aries, we're leaving the realm of the irrational, which is associated to the Neptunian realm of Pisces, and we're entering into the realm of the rational. Aries rules the head, right? We're leaving the feminine influence, the yin influence, and we're entering into the masculine influence, the yang influence. And so there's a lot of talk of irrational and rational, people pointing to people and saying, you're being irrational, and people pointing back and saying, no, I'm the rational one. You're the one who's being irrational, and no one knows what to believe. The fact of the matter is, which we think of when we think of Neptune, the water cycle, you have the water in the ocean, which evaporates and goes up into the air and becomes clouds, which become heavy and which rain, and they rain upon the water and bring the ocean a little bit higher than it was before, and they start that cycle of evaporation and rain over and over again. It's the water cycle. The water that we drink nowadays, if you look at your bottled water, is the same water that existed in prehistoric oceans. It's been recycling itself over and over again. This is why the element of water was associated with the soul, and this is why the element of water was associated with reincarnation, the return of the soul again and again. So the rational and the irrational are linked to one another cyclically. You can't choose one over the other. You can't live with one and dismiss the other, because the other will call to you again, whether it's the call of your mind or the call of your soul. So as we prepare to cross over this threshold, Neptune is more than just disillusionment. Neptune haunts us. Neptune inspires us. But Neptune also holds in its hands redemption and salvation. It's something only a soul, a lost soul perhaps, can understand. If you enjoyed what you saw, please press the like button. It helps more than you know. If you could subscribe, that would be wonderful. I've had such a wonderful time visiting with you this week, and I can't wait to get together next time on Christopher Renstrom Astrology.